Peanut butter being caught on the roof of your mouth. Spiders. Clowns. Things that go bump in the night. Failure of being found out, or of losing someone that you've loved or never had in the first place. I wonder what it is that brings you out in a cold sweat, makes your heart beat faster and twists in your stomach. And if you are struggling to think of anything that brings you to that sense of fear, perhaps just recall the last decade or so in contemporary culture. A time when religious control has been eroded by doubt and failures of those in power. When newspapers went from being the guardians of truth to paying informants and bringing us fake news. When politicians shifted from serving the people to lining their pockets with additional expenses, perjury in the courthouses, and civil servants travelling to Barnard Castle for their eye tests. When celebrity culture produced high-end career success for such a limited few, while shaming the many under the auspice of talent and fixing voting systems behind the scenes. When presidential campaigns feature misogyny and lawlessness, and when presidents are acquitted of both. When we need campaigns to remind us that Black Lives Matter, that women's bodies aren't to be abused, when a teenager has to remind us that the creation is important. When the sick and those with disabilities are shut away for months on end to protect them from a deadly virus, only to be treated differently by the very system set up to protect them, unable to tolerate their complex needs in the face of an emergency pandemic. When lifeboats of trafficked refugees are turned away from these safer shores, and when camps of hopeful in Calais are regularly displaced in case they get too comfortable in their shantytowns. When we're still twinning toilets with the lowest and the least. When our faces remain covered and we're scared that so do our hearts. When 1 in 4 adults are on prescription medication for anxiety and stress or psychotic disorders, and 1 in 3 in the USA are similarly medicated. When in line for a COVID vaccine, people have to be shown how to queue again, to remind them that eye contact matters. And when clinicians realise that this jab into the arm is the first human contact that some have had in the best part of a year. You see, from peanut butter to the absolutely debilitating experiences of fear, from individual stresses to the whole of society. Fear is a powerful emotional force at work in every system that we engage with. Welcome to the 21st century. Some may say that we are now living in a culture of fear. These feelings become so familiar to us that they now become the driving force behind our politics, our economics, our social systems, our voting habits, our belief systems, and even our relationships. COVID, after all, has only highlighted what has been happening all the time. And so as we enter this Christian festival of Lent, it perhaps isn't a surprise that we are focusing on parts of our lives that we wish to be disassociated from, parts of our life that bring us dissatisfaction or make us feel quite uneasy. It's the gift of this morbid season to begin to name and know the painful and the difficult so that we can face the future with hope, the hope that resurrection brings. But even I'm starting to feel a little bit sick, having recited what I already have. So what I want is to leave us feeling a little less nauseous. But to do that, I want us to first experience something of the science of fear. What actually happens to our body, our mind, and our souls when we are afraid? Secondly, I want to take a whistle-stop tour experiencing and exploring what fear looked like for Jesus in Scripture. After all, fear isn't new. And then I want to offer some really practical ways as to how we might be able to live well, perhaps even flourish within a culture of fear. And I'll be doing that using the now infamous moniker of hands, face, and space. Now, more than ever, we need to not be consumed by the prevailing patterns, rhythms, or culture which surrounds us, a culture of fear, but to prayerfully seek the transformation of our minds, our bodies, and our soul, in a paraphrase of St. Paul. So firstly, what actually is fear, and what does it do to us? Fear is located within the brain. It takes over every part of your body, stimulating every part of the 12 nervous system endings that start and finish within your brain patterns. Fear is contagious. Fear can be an addictive even in itself. So although the fight or flight responses, which are controlled by the emotional center of your brain, fear then impacts every one of your body's systems. Prolonged experiences of fear, technically called trauma, can impact the body for decades to come. So the technical bit. When people encounter something which frightens them, the hypothalamus in the brain reacts and releases a whole host of chemicals into the sympathetic nervous system. Signals are sent out, firing from the brain to release stress hormones like adrenaline and dopamine. These kick the body into a higher gear, and so you become tense and alert. Your hands start to tingle. They may even go numb. Our handy aid memoir, hands, face, space, starts here. At the same time, another part of your body is secreting hormones which raise your heart rate. Your blood pressure increases. Your pupils dilate so that you can take in as much light as possible, so that you can see every shadow moving. Non-essential items such as the immune system and your digestion turn themselves off, making sure that you're able to cope with emergency function. This is why you can feel sick as the stress hormones release after an event. The veins in your skin contract, circulating blood to the most vital parts of your body, which is why you go grey and pale. And it's difficult to focus on small tasks as your brain becomes preoccupied with being on high alert. You lose track of where you put things. You can't find your words. You forget what day it is. You become foggy and vague. Familiar faces become mere shadows. And in short doses, it's absolutely exhilarating. It's the feeling that happens when you leap the loop on a roller coaster, or as you scream your way around a ghost train. It's why horror movies are quite so delicious. They help us feel. But in the long term, when these short doses become higher and more prolonged spikes of stress and trauma, your body simply cannot cope. Over time, living in this heightened state of awareness leads to a repetitive cycle of traumatic memory. And it can lead to all sorts of different consequences. Prolonged fear within the body can lead to immune system dysfunction, endocrine dysfunction and diabetes, sleep and wake cycle disruption. You're either very, very sleepy or insomniacal, eating disorders, substance abuse, that extra glass of wine, or the extra set of painkillers. And permanent changes happen within your brain structure, seen under an MRI scan. The way that your brain is pre-programmed to respond to emotional responses, stories, the creative arts, all cease to function. This then means that headaches turn to migraines, muscle aches to fibromyalgia or ME, body aches to ongoing chronic pain, which in itself needs to be medicated, and difficulty breathing can turn technically to asthma. And that's only what happens to your body, your insides and your joints and your muscles. What happens in your mind is even more complex. Because living in chronic fear and in the memory of trauma means that you disassociate from yourself. You become somewhat disengaged and disembodied. You're unable to feel love or show it to other people. You start to have anxiety and mood swings, getting angry or stressed at the slightest thing. Obsessive compulsive thoughts begin to take over. You're unable to hold down long-term relationships. And it's a family show, so there's bedroom malfunction. But there are also things that happen to your soul and to your spirit. Chronic fear on your environmental health means that there is a fear of moving to any new situation. And so you become locked down yourself. You don't want to get out, even out of your own house. There's a phobia of leaving the house, and there's an inability to have any form of ambition. You live with the lowest expectations of yourself and others, and that affects the way that you treat each other, the fabric of the buildings that you are locked within, and the way that you create the created order around you. Research with Aboriginal Australian communities suggests that those who live with chronic fear become genetically predispositioned to a lower quality of life, low income levels, and high addictive behaviours. And the potential consequence of chronic fear on your spiritual health is a bitterness towards God, doubt, frustration, and anger towards God and to clergy, a loss of trust, a loss of faith, a desire for God to fix it without doing anything about it, and despair and doubt, which is related to the loss of spirituality altogether. Fear affects every cell in your body, every fibre of your being, every relationship that you seek to forge. And it's important that we name this up front, because if the hypothesis is right and we are living in a culture of fear, then our experiences within a recent global pandemic, a global trauma, if you like, means that we're not only living with our own phobias and foibles, we're at the precipice of how we live in and speak out of God's good news today. When the whole world is experiencing the trauma of fear, how can we as a Christian community be in the best possible shape to respond to ourselves and to the world around us? Living within a culture of fear, we have two tasks: to know and love ourselves. That means knowing what fear does to us. And to know and love other people, recognizing what a culture of fear is doing to them. For some of you right now, that was an interesting revelation, a piece of scientific theory that was helpful to a point, but let's get to the Jesus bit if we can. We will get there in a few moments' time. However, for some or many of us, I suspect what I've just described, even in bullet points, cuts a little more deeply. And in a broadcast service with a zoomed in preacher, it's easy to hide the impact of some simply crafted words and some scientific theory. So before we move on, I want us to take the breath and to know ourselves, to register and acknowledge what is already going on in our bodies and our minds, perhaps even in our relationship with Jesus. So take a breath. And notice where you're holding the tension. A clenched jaw, hunched up shoulders, clenched fingers. And try to relax it out. Some of you, my words will have cut more deeply, and you're experiencing other emotions of anger or panic or anxiety. You know your coping mechanisms. Feel free to press pause quite literally and do what you need to do. But please make sure that you follow this up with a church leader or within a safe therapeutic community when you are ready to do so. None of us are immune to fear, and our bodies keep the score. Well, that was rather dystopian, wasn't it? God somehow distant and to blame, causing us to doubt and lose our faith. Our bodies keeping the score and breaking down almost imperceptibly and yet completely genetically, where our brains physically change irreconcilably and irreparably to the fear that we find ourselves living within merely because we are living through the 21st century. What we need to do, I think, is to notice that some of these trials, tribulations, and experiences are not unique to us. The way that we're experiencing them and the impact that they're having upon us, yes, may be different, and certainly our understanding of them are certainly different. But the genius of Jesus, God in human form, God in flesh and blood and fear and love, means that we do have good news. We do have a gospel of hope. because Jesus faced at least some of the fears that we have already described. At the beginning of this sermon, I listed a myriad ways that living in the 21st century is a particularly depressing place to be, as we've perpetuated fear over the last decade or so from every institution known to humanity: religion, celebrity culture, environmental science, social justice campaigns, politicians. The list went on and on and on. But we see that also for Jesus. The world in which Jesus walked had a decline in religious authority and significant abuses in power. After all, Jesus was so triggered by it that in his own anxiety, he overturned the tables in the temple. He spent his time debating with the people that thought they had all the answers. He didn't want them to corner the market on what it was to be faithful. The religious system for Jesus was based on a no one being worthy enough system of sacrifice, sacrifices being the order of the day and the cost that Jesus would pay. Abuses in banking systems are rife within the Jesus narratives. Jesus sat and ate with tax collectors. He called one to follow him and be his disciple, but it took meals for him to discuss balancing the books. And the highest political leader in the land, Pontius Pilate, asked the question behind all other questions: what is truth? Before condemning Jesus to death at the hand of the tabloids and the ragamuffins, calling out for Jesus' celebrity status to be eradicated before Barabbas's power and freedom. In Jesus' culture, not all people are created equal, and yet Jesus spoke from and into a different culture. He received grace and blessing from those who were caricatured as unclean as they washed his feet with oil and dried it with their hair. He literally went out of his way to befriend and heal the lepers, those outcast into a community that no one else would touch. And when one woman's torture and trauma of abuse became a battleground between religious authorities, Jesus literally drew a line in the sand that no one could cross. Jesus had little to say, but plenty of action when it came to xenophobia, misogyny, racism, intolerance, and inequality. To those with the least, Jesus gave bread. To those who thought they knew better, Jesus told stories and asked them to imagine that another world was possible. To those living with trauma, Jesus listened and healed. And when all of this was offered by Jesus to everyone else, Jesus then faced his own fears. Kneeling in a garden, a broken man, betrayed, disowned, and doubting of his own journey, he still chose the difficult way of hope through the way of the cross. Perfect love casts out all fear, and through the cross of Jesus, love wins. Jesus' life is marked by some of the same features that I've already suggested we're experiencing today. Jesus knew what it was to be surrounded by fear, how fear controlled people, was lorded over people, manipulated people, and condemned people. And yet he embodied a life which showed up to those living in fear, who stood up for those who were being manipulated or who were outcast and marginalized, who saw those who had lost sight of what community could mean and called them to hope for something more and something better. He showed them love and called them back to life. Right now, I needed Jesus who calls us back to life when the statistics of death are a trauma I don't want to bear. We need to cling on to the hope that the worst thing is never the last thing. We need to be wooed back into a relationship with the God who first loves us, however broken we are, whatever traumas are weaving their way into our dreams and our nightmares and into the very fibre of our being. And we need hope to act as our antidote to fear, our vaccine in the midst of all that we're experiencing right now. And we need more of that than any fairy tale ending or hero on a stallion can provide. This Lent, I need to see more of this hope-filled Jesus, a Jesus who has walked my human journey, who knows my pain, who sees the world in all its trauma, and from that vulnerability shows us a perfect love which casts out all fear, a love which will literally go to hell and back to open up hope and life and love. So what can we do about it? As I've said, we have a helpful moniker that is following us throughout this pandemic: hands, face, space. And I want to use that to help us as we find ways to live well within a culture of fear. The opposite of fear is not fearless. It's not courageous. The opposite of fear is hope. How do we live in a way that embodies hope and brings us back to the realities of our bodies, our mind, and our soul, that we may love God, love each other, and love ourselves within this strange culture we find ourselves in? So by hands, I mean our bodies. By face, I mean our mind. And by space, I mean our spiritual centre. Hands, face, space. Body, mind, and soul, as a wise ancient once summarized. So, hands, at least our bodies. The Marine Commando unit have something called square breathing. It's physiologically designed to change the way that you hold yourself in your body. But it is really simple. It means you breathe in for the count of 2. Hold for the count of 2. Breathe out for the count of 2. And hold for a count of 2. And you can do that again to the count of 3 around the square. Breathe in, hold, breathe out, hold. I'm not sure that many of us are training to be Marine Commandos, but it is quite useful in a situation to have a simple breathing exercise which brings us back to ourselves. Coming back to hands, face, space, another way of doing a breathing exercise is to hold your hand and to trace your fingers, breathing in on the up movement and down. You breathe out, breathe in and out, breathe in and out, breathe in and out, and in and out. That process is called take 5. But also recognize what is happening in your body. Where do you hold your tension, and how can you stretch it out? Perhaps it's as simple as taking more regular baths with some scented oils. It may be finding Pilates or yoga online. You may even want to buy a massage unit or some moisturizing gel. whatever it is that helps you to stretch your muscles and to release some of the tension that your body is carrying. And please, if you are exhibiting any of the stress symptoms that we've mentioned earlier, seek the medical help that you need. Your body keeps the score, and you are too precious to be lost to a culture of fear. So face what's going on in your mind. It may be that you need to just switch off social media, or at least to stop doom scrolling. Don't watch the briefings when they're on. Maybe read some of the Psalms, learn some scripture, read poetry and listen to more stories. One psychologist has said this: imagination is critical to the quality of our lives. We're able to leave room for our routine existence because we can envision new possibilities. Imagination is the launch pad for making your hopes come true. Without imagination, there is no hope. So what is it that spurs your imagination? What creative art do you need to make time for? What story do you need to tell or watch or listen to? And don't forget that being in lockdown may be a trigger for you for your past, or maybe the trigger for abuses happening behind closed doors that no one else knows about. If you are not safe, find help. And then space. Go outside, even for 20 minutes every day. Look at the sky, dance in the rain, dig in the garden, notice the daffodils. Invest in ways that you can plant the good. Encourage people in emails rather than be critical. Find ways to consider the environment and recycle your bottles. Find ways to stay connected, even though it's really difficult to do that through a screen. And tune into the seasons, lean into Lent. Perhaps do something this Lent that you've never done before, using a different creative skill or rhythm or routine or theological perspective. Hands, face, space, all helping us to come back to ourselves, to our bodies, to our minds, to our souls. Because if we are to live lives which are free from fear, if we are to live lives which are full of faith and hope and love, if we are to live in relationship with a God through whom all fear is extinguished, then we need to take our fear and our trauma seriously. We need to know what is happening to our bodies and to our minds, and keep our minds set on the things of the kingdom. Faith, hope, and love. After all, the opposite of fear is not fearlessness. The opposite of fear is faith. And these three things remain: faith, hope, and love. Hands, face, space. Faith, hope, and love. And we will get through this too, together. Because in Christ, perfect love casts out all fear.